Carl Freedman, welcome back to Nostalgia Trap. It's good to see you.
Oh, good to be here again.
We had a great chat last time you and I saw each other on Zoom like this about the JFK assassination. And we had planned to talk about JFK and Nixon. And I realized halfway through that conversation, we were never going to get to give the full treatment to Richard Nixon. And what he deserves as a historical figure, and even what Oliver Stone deserves for creating the film Nixon, which I know you've written about. But Nixon as a monster is such an important part of understanding American politics and culture. To me, it's like a gigantic subject. I know it is to you as well. So I'm wondering kind of where we start. I was thinking at what point did you understand the gravity of Richard Nixon? Was it when he was elected president, or was there a buildup, or was there times before that in your memory in which you kind of recognized, oh, this guy is sort of a rising figure, or he's something different in American politics?
Well, let's see. I knew of Richard Nixon from 1960 on. I was in the fourth grade then, and I had a big lapel button. I still have it. It's over in the next room there, propped against some books, which said if I were 21, I'd vote for Kennedy. So I didn't know much about Nixon. My parents thought that he was, one of the most horrible people ever to appear in American politics. I was for Kennedy. We were Democrats, but I didn't really know much in detail about Nixon. But then he kept sort of following me around, as it were, as I grew up. He was prominent in 1964. It was actually thought, I remember, because by this time I was actually following politics fairly closely. I would have been about 13 at the time. Journalists and so forth were at one point in leading up to the Republican convention thought that Nixon was actually the most likely nominee. Of course, that didn't happen, but he was heavily involved in the Goldwater campaign. He was heavily involved in the off-year elections in 1966, and then, of course, in 1968. He was elected president. This was the time of the Vietnam War. By 1969, I was off to college, where everybody hated him. I mean, not literally everybody, but so it seemed, at least, the crowd that I ran in,
Right.
All the people who were on anti-war demonstrations.
Well, it's weird because it's like you hear this in all the pop culture I got from the 80s, and we talked about this last time. It's sort of like this sort of Hollywood story of the 60s. Nixon was always the villain. Nixon is always like the bad guy that comes, the boogeyman that sort of comes and ruins the hippies party, and is sort of the villain of the age. And then the other narrative I get is that, and I'm getting it more and more from like people like Tucker Carlson, American conservatives, is that Nixon is won these like popular landslide elections, and that he's one of the most popular presidents of all time. And really tapped into, as you write about, I think most intriguingly, what I want to get into, tapped into like the American psychology in a really important way. So it's funny because it's like this Nixon as this aberration, but also this like perfectly American person. There's an enigma or paradox there to me.
Right. Yeah. And, the thing is, about the contrasting views of Nixon that you were just paraphrasing, the interesting thing is both are true.
Right.
I tried to indicate that two of the epigraphs to my book on Nixon, which remains my personal favorite, will always be my personal favorite of all the books.
Let's say the name of it. It's called The Age of Nixon, A Study in Cultural Power. And yeah, it's a different take on Nixon, and it reminded me of a little bit of one of my favorite books on Nixon, which is by Gary Wills, the Nixon Agonistes. Is it
Nixon Agonistes, which is my favorite book on Nixon.
Right. So I'm glad that those things are in harmony, because it really I love that like psychological take, because to me it's like Nixon is just a fascinating creature that way.
Wills's book is, I think, quite brilliant. It was written very early. Well, not very early, but it was written just shortly after Nixon was elected president in 1968. Wills was a journalist, following the campaign, talking to Nixon a bit on the campaign trail. But yeah, it's a brilliant book. The only book on Nixon that I like more than my own. But where I was going, saying that two of the epigraphs to my book. The first one is by Hunter Thompson, who, he was one of the most creatively vitriolic American journalists since H.L. Mencken, probably the most creatively vitriolic since H.L. Mencken, and he was more vitriolic about nothing than he was about Nixon. And it's a passage written not long after Nixon had resigned the presidency, and it goes on with tremendous vitriol. And then right below it is an excerpt from Bob Dole's eulogy at Nixon's funeral, which of course is, very commendatory. And yet both passages say in a way the same thing, that Nixon was quintessentially American. And that's the major theme of
I love that. That's like, he's like a Rorschach test, right? It's like how you view Nixon is how you view America in some way. The Hunter S. Thompson stuff, honestly, I think it was reading his writing about Nixon that first communicated to me what you're talking about, which is sort of like this demonic vision of Nixon as a representative of a demonic streak in American life and in American history that Thompson wrote about so eloquently, and also so vitriolically, and just in that counterculture way that for whatever reason made me understand that Nixon was important in representing all the things I hated about this country, and all the things that I hated about the people of this country. But that's a disturbing thing to think, because it's sort of like, Nixon did win by huge landslides, and I think still is I don't know, how much an active hero he is for people, but his spirit is kind of active in the American political imagination very powerfully still, it seems like.
Oh yeah, it certainly is. He won one election by a landslide when he ran for re-election as president in 1972. He carried 49 states and won about 60% of the popular vote, which is as there've been a few other comparable landslides, but that's as good as it gets in the history of American presidential elections. And of course, in recent years, nothing approaching that has happened. The last one was Reagan in '84, who also won 49 states and about 60% of the popular vote. This is another topic, obviously, but
that's a lot of people voting for him, though, and that's that thing. I think it happened with Trump too, in the sense of you begin to imagine who are these people that are voting for Richard Nixon? Who are these people who are voting for Donald Trump? And that, I think it's sort of like the realization that there's sort of everyone that's around you. There's a big population that's into that. And I think that's sort of a depressing thing for a lot of people who look at people like Nixon and Trump as these kind of grotesque monsters. I can only imagine, I'm sure Hunter Thompson did write about Donald Trump at some point, but he didn't live long enough to see him as president. But I can imagine he would draw him in the same way that like Ralph Steadman draws Nixon, as this sort of drooling psychopath. And then to realize, 76 million people are voting for this guy is kind of distressing.
Actually, I mean, there is a real link between Nixon and Trump. Actually, a few years ago, I published an article in the Los Angeles Review of Books called "From Nixon to Trump," which is about that connection. But let us defend our fellow countrymen and women.
Yes.
To the point of noting that Trump was never popular in the way that Nixon really was for a while. I mean, Trump lost the popular vote both times he ran for president. His approval ratings as president were always relatively low. He had and has a certain popularity in that there is a by no means inconsiderable minority of Americans who passionately love him. But that's different from Nixon, who did for a while have a huge majority.
Well, there's to me the Nixon as sort of the narrative of Nixon as sort of interrupter of a kind of cultural revolution that was happening, and an anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, and sort of like the guy that sort of puts the brakes on the 1960s. How much of that was the narrative that you were aware of at that point? Because it seems like he consciously cast himself as the enemy of those forces, right?
Oh yes, I mean, quite clearly, quite explicitly. There was nothing subtle, particularly about it. And I think, speaking from the point of view of people like me, people who were, in the anti-war movement, people who supported the civil rights movement. I mean, Nixon was the enemy. That was quite clear. Now, one of the ironies about the retrospective consideration of Nixon, which some people actually pointed out a bit at the time, many people have pointed it out in retrospect, is that Nixon was in many ways rather liberal by the standards of his successors.
I just put up a poll on Twitter of who would you prefer as American president in 2024, Barack Obama or Richard Nixon? And Nixon won so far, by the way, on the poll. And I don't know what that is not a scientific poll, so it's just a bunch of people on Twitter. But a lot of people were commenting that, exactly what you're saying. Well, Nixon is actually more liberal than Obama, to the left of Obama on virtually every issue, and that sort of thing. And what do we do with that? Because it seems like there's a lot to say about sort of where Nixon was as a policy person, and how much things have changed since. Because it seems like there are paradoxes and ironies in there as well.
Well, I think. One thing we have to remember is that any presidency, or for that matter, any, non-presidential political career, is always a creature of its age. And a presidential administration is defined not only by what the president personally wants to do, but by the political context, by the political surround. Nixon was never exactly, well, he was never at all a New Dealer, but he more or less inherited his mentor Eisenhower's view of things, that although the New Deal shouldn't be expanded very much, it shouldn't be repealed either. This was an innovation in Republican politics that Eisenhower was primarily
Mm-hmm.
responsible for. Because during the New Deal, the standard Republican position was to oppose Roosevelt and all of the works of his administration. Eisenhower came along and said, "That's crazy. That's never going to win an election." And of course, he won 2 landslides by what he called modern republicanism, which meant republicanism that more or less accepted the New Deal. And
that's, I don't want to interrupt. That's so interesting, considering like how Republicans today are sort of like touching that third rail of Social Security and Medicare and like seeing if they can push it. Because like, I mean, it's been decades since then. And yet there's still, that question is still there, is like, how much can you push against the base New Deal welfare state and see where that takes you electorally?
Sure, I would say that, I mean, the shift comes from Eisenhower, the shift within Republican politics. It comes between Eisenhower and Reagan. I mean, with Reagan, you get the Republicans' resumption of their traditional opposition to the New Deal and all its works, repealing Social Security or privatizing it or reforming it. It's all the same thing, really. Is so unpopular that they haven't been able to do it, and they have to be a little bit gingerly about it. But with Reagan, there came a real change. Nixon, kind of a transitional figure between the republicanism of Eisenhower and the republicanism of Reagan, and he was not particularly opposed to most of the New Deal. He did expand bits of it, actually, here and there. Now, I mean, we can look more granularly at the political context. People point out that, for instance, the Clean Air, Clean Water, those acts, the Environmental Protection Agency, the expansion of Social Security, all of these liberal New Deal things happened, and others did too. Others happened during the Nixon administration. But they were passed; those were bills passed by Congress.
Yeah, I feel like the policy element of Nixon is not so much what we sort of think about when we think about the way that Nixon sort of infected American culture or kind of created. I mean, I think about the Rick Perlstein book, Nixon Land, that's sort of like,
that's good.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, I'll paraphrasing his thesis badly. It's essentially that Nixon, shifted the way that Americans think about politics and sort of created a divisiveness that we see in that accelerated. And I think you could argue about the degree to which that's true and how much that those things were present in American politics before and after Nixon. But it seems like in our age, there's something specific about Nixon's viciousness, the way he talked about enemies, the way he intervened in the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement, civil rights movement. I'll give you one example, and I wonder how, what it felt like during that era for you, and in thinking about it years later, because there's that like I bring it up a lot. This sort of James Michener piece about Kent State, and the shooting at Kent State. He
wrote a book about it.
Yeah, he wrote a book about it, and there's like an excerpt in one of these books I have about reporting Vietnam, in which he lists all he has all these excerpts from editorials and like letters to the editor of the like local newspaper in Ohio, and it was just like page after page, and they had to keep printing editorials because they got getting so many letters for a week or two of people that were all saying the same thing, which is sort of like it's about time the National Guard started opening fire on these students, kill them all kind of thing. And it was a sort of like really vicious outburst of violent energy aimed at young people and radicals and this sort of, reactionary thing. But it's coming from just, ordinary Americans. And I wonder how much that ties in with what we're thinking about with Nixon, is sort of like tapping into that stream,
Oh yeah,
whatever
oh,
that is. Yeah.
very, very much so. Yeah, I mean, and those people you're referring to writing those letters to the editor, I'm sure they all voted for Nixon, right?
Right.
Um, Except perhaps a small contingent who thought that Nixon was too liberal, even then. In 1968, of course, a lot of them would have voted for Wallace. Um, and
Right. Right.
and in 1972, a tiny minority voted for one John Schmitz, a John Birch Society congressman who actually ran for president on the ticket of the party that Wallace had established 4 years earlier, where Wallace had actually returned to the Democrats. At that point. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you mentioned the term culture a moment ago, and yeah, that's key. I mean, the subtitle of my book, as you quoted, is a study in cultural power. Um, um, in domestic policy, because foreign policy is complicated yet again, but sticking with domestic policy for the time being. Yeah, Nixon was not particularly illiberal on matters of economic policy, and yeah, as I was saying a moment ago, I mean, a number of the liberal things that happened during his administration were simply laws passed overwhelmingly by a Democratic Congress, which he chose not to veto. He wasn't always very enthusiastic about them, and sometimes tried to stop them behind the scenes while they were passing, but he wasn't willing to veto them. But culturally, yeah, that was another thing. And this, of course, was Nixon's history. Remember, I mean, he emerges in 1946, running for a House seat from California that nobody thought any Republican had a chance at, let alone this total unknown. He was a small town lawyer. He was a veteran of the U.S. Navy, just out of the U.S. Navy at that time. And he did this by attaching himself to the anti-communist hysteria that was beginning to sweep the country, and eventually became the most powerful, the most effective politician of anti-communism, with the single exception of Joe McCarthy, although in some ways he was more effective than McCarthy. McCarthy was made a big splash for a short period of time, but burned out pretty quickly. Nixon was, of course, much more durable.
Yeah, Nixon sort of carries the McCarthy legacy. I never really thought of it that way, that McCarthy is sort of a flash in some ways and is dead by like 1959, I think.
Yeah, I think a little bit earlier than that even. Yeah, but yeah, sometime around then. Yeah, he drank himself to death.
Talk about dark. I mean, a lot of the clips of younger Nixon that I've seen are from like documentaries like Atomic Cafe that show all this sort of like him in the center of all of these, the Alger Hiss trial and all this anti-communist stuff. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that your parents already hated Nixon by 1960. Is it because of his association with the anti-communist hysteria? Is it
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, they were Democrats. I mean, they would have voted for the Democratic nominee, in any case. But yeah, they certainly voted against. Put it this way: they in 1960 they voted against Nixon with far greater enthusiasm than they had voted against Eisenhower for Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and 1956. I guess I had a chance to vote against Nixon only once. My first vote was cast for George McGovern in 1972. It didn't do any good, of course, but that was my first vote.
I was remembering the other element of Rick Perlstein's sort of take is sort of the resentment element, the idea of kind of like Nixon's inborn hatred of elites and East Coast people and the Ivy League and that sort of thing. How much is that part of the way we sort of think of what Nixon's cultural power is in terms of like?
Yeah, it's
class part. Yeah.
absolutely crucial uh, the way that I see Nixon. Certainly, the sort of core theoretical chapter of my book is called Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Nixon, um, and it takes three categories, one from each of those thinkers. The category, or generally considered the three, most outside the natural sciences, the three most influential uh, theorists of modernity. I take the category of the petty bourgeoisie from Marx, the category of eroticism, um, anal eroticism, sorry, Freud, but from Nietzsche, yeah, ressentiment, resentment. I'm the three are all closely related and all find this amazingly perfect expression. So I argue in Nixon. But yes, resentment, and by
an eroticized resentment in a certain class. I'm trying to synthesize the Marx, the Nietzsche, and the Freud there, because it seems like, I'm thinking about MAGA and sort of like my as much as I can imagine, and I have to imagine because I'm a little bit younger than you, and I wasn't alive during this time, and I have to imagine what the Nixon people were like. It's very easy for me to imagine what the Trump people are like because I'm living in this era, and that sort of reading of sort of a through line with class and a sort of Freudian erotic element at play. All of it seems very clear in the Trump thing, almost like in a much more visual way than it was during Nixon. You had to really look. You had to really look at this beyond the surface of Nixon to see all that stuff. But with Trump, it seems like it's very much on the surface.
Absolutely, there are differences. There are a number of important differences between Nixon and Trump, but there is also a tremendous amount of continuity, and it's no coincidence, actually, despite the considerable period of time that separates them on the political stage. Nixon, after all, left the political stage when he resigned the presidency in 1974, and then he died 20 years later in 1994. Trump, although he was a kind of celebrity as a real estate baron in New York, he doesn't really become a political figure until maybe around 2015, or it was a little bit before he declared for president, when he started doing all the stuff about Obama wasn't born in the United States.
Right.
He was clearly preparing, for a political career. So there's a considerable length of time between the two figures, but there are actually individuals who are, who worked for both, who are sort of living links between them. Perhaps the most important is Roger Stone, who was a very young Nixon operative. His general attitude towards Nixon can be perfectly summed up by the fact that he actually has a picture of Nixon's head tattooed on his body.
Right.
And then, of course,
I've seen Roger Stone's Nixon tattoo. There's a cult allegiance to Nixon that seems like, it's weird because it's so much. We can talk about the Oliver Stone film, which sort of gets at this, but there's a kind of like, I don't know, a group of men mostly, and I guess the plumbers are part of that have an allegiance to Nixon that is intense. And yeah, the tattoo of Roger Stone. I was thinking of Roy Cohn as well as a link between these two figures, Trump and Nixon.
Yeah, Cohn, who was Trump's mentor until characteristically when Cohn was disbarred and was dying of AIDS, Trump threw him over and denied that he had ever, really known the guy very. He's just one of my lawyers, I think, is the way he expressed it. But yeah, for a long time, Cohn was of course a contemporary of Nixon's, but Cohn of course worked with McCarthy, and Nixon's relationship to McCarthy was complicated, actually. I mean, as I quote, I can quote from my book that he quietly assisted McCarthy when that seemed the prudent course, and quietly betrayed McCarthy when that seemed the prudent course. You have to remember that Eisenhower always hated McCarthy because McCarthy had attacked his mentor, General Marshall. McCarthy had in effect called him a traitor.
And Eisenhower didn't like Nixon much either, right?
There's evidence of that is somewhat conflicting, but yeah, I think the bulk of the evidence does suggest that.
Interesting.
That they were never personally close.
Yeah, I think Eisenhower was going to dump him. That's what the Chequers speech was about, right? In part.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Nixon was expected to. Eisenhower delivered just when Nixon went on the air, just before he went on the air. Eisenhower sent a message to Nixon through Thomas Dewey, who was kind of a right-hand man and fixer for Eisenhower at that period in his career, saying that Nixon should end the speech by resigning from the ticket, which of course Nixon refused to do. But then the response among Republicans, at least, was so overwhelmingly favorable to Nixon. It was a tremendously successful speech. People always make fun of it. But in its time, it was one of the most successful political speeches in American history.
Well, that's the thing about Nixon. He's so brilliant as a politician, but at the same time, when you read the details of him behind the scenes, he's so manipulative. And there's a cynicism to the way he moves politically. And I wonder if that's like part of the contribution and part of what we talk about when he shifts, not policy wise, but culturally or something. It's the sort of cynicism and the feeling of like a dark vision of how things work and what you got to do to make it work. Or make yourself survive in the system. I guess that in a lot of ways, Nixon maybe taps into some feeling that a lot of Americans have, that they're the underdog fighting against corruption or something. It feels like Trump does the same thing.
Well, you have resentment again. I think
right.
Is the key category there. Nixon was politically brilliant and politically very successful with one exception, I would say, for his entire career until towards the end, because I mean, Watergate was kind of a self-destruction, as he seems to have implicitly said in the most famous lines. Remember, it was the last speech he gave in the White House, not the speech the evening before when he resigned the presidency on national television, but when he then delivered his farewell speech the next morning before actually leaving the White House to his staff. How do the famous lines go? Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
Wow.
Which he seems to have realized what he had done. But prior to like the last couple of years, years that were dominated by Watergate, I'd say he made only one significant mistake in his career, and that was running for governor of California in 1962. He lost a lot by losing, and he didn't have that much to gain, even if he had won.
And even if we and I agree that Watergate obviously is a miscalculation politically, but he in a lot of ways, I mean, he he sets himself up not to be. He's not prosecuted. Other people go to jail for this. He's kind of slithers away and really kind of restores his legacy as a diplomat and everything like that. And by the time I'm in high school and I'm watching the Oliver Stone film Nixon, I'm sort of have a tear in my eye about the guy a little bit, right? Like there's something in that film that is like tragic. And Oliver Stone, I think, he's that 60s guy that carries a lot of that resentment towards Nixon and everything he represented, but he also lifts him into a godlike sort of place in that movie. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that.
Oh, yeah, I completely.
You wrote a book about it, so.
Yeah, well, and in my book on the three Oliver Stone films, I make the generic distinction that JFK is based on the genre of melodrama. The film about George W. Bush is based on farce, and yeah, Nixon is based on tragedy. It is a tragedy. I think that several people actually say that in the course of the film. Henry Kissinger says that. Leonid Brezhnev. They both just describe Nixon as a tragic figure, and I think that is the point of view of the film itself. And of course, a tragic figure, can be bad in many ways, can be evil in many ways, but cannot be simply despicable.
Mm.
Right.
Right.
I mean, he must have, some real. Well, take I guess the greatest, one of the two greatest tragic traditions of all time, the Shakespearean tragic tradition. Macbeth is a really evil character. I mean, look at all he does: assassinates people, has children killed, and so forth. Of course, it all begins when he has his king. It's assassinated, so that's both murder and treason. But he's not a purely evil figure the way, let's say, Richard III in that earlier play by Shakespeare is. I mean, he has some substance to him. He's not merely despicable, and I think that's very much the way Stone sees Nixon, and I think that's a perfectly valid way to see him.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because it's, first of all, I mean, it's 1995 when that movie comes out, somewhere in there, right? The Stone Nixon.
Yeah,
which sort of leads into like the Tony Soprano, Al Swearingen, all these sort of like, I mean, even Don Draper on Mad Men, like this sort of age of prestige dramas on TV where there's sort of, big, powerful men doing evil things. I mean, Walter White, I guess, is one of them too on Breaking Bad, but it's like that. It seems like nuance and seeing the tragedy within the powerful evil man is something that, it goes all the way back to Shakespeare, but I guess was rediscovered by HBO in the late 90s and 2000s, because it seems like a pretty standard American trope. And I can't help but think that that's part of, I don't know, part of the way we keep these figures sort of going in a way, as we're compelled to see the humanity in them, I guess. My question was sort of like, did you think Hunter S. Thompson saw the nuance in Nixon, or did he see him as a tragic figure, or did he see him as like pure villain?
I'm sorry, did who see Nixon that way?
Hunter S. Thompson, because he didn't. He wrote in it's funny because I think his writing and who he was as a person are sometimes different things. But I just wonder if Thompson sort of had a view of Nixon that was like Stone's in any way, because it seemed like Stone is sort of recovering a humanity that Thompson does not see in him.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Much as I always enjoyed Thompson's writing on Nixon, I read all of them, as they were originally being published, at least in book form. I might not have read all the articles in Rolling Stone. But yeah, as much as I enjoy that writing, it is kind of two-dimensional in a way compared to Stone's view of Nixon, or Robert Coover's view of Nixon.
I don't know that one. Tell me about Robert Coover.
It's another of the great works of art about Nixon. It's a novel. The public burning refers to the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953. And every other chapter is actually narrated by Nixon.
Wow.
And
it reminds me of Angels in America, the Tony Kushner, which has Roy Cohn, and I think Roy Cohn at some point is having these long conversations with the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg, if I recall. Yeah,
because Cohn was he was the second. He was not the lead, but he was the second sheriff prosecutor. Yeah, who prosecuted the Rosenbergs and got the death penalties. Yeah, no one thought that, for such a completely horrible person as Roy Cohn, he has this posthumous triumph. At least he's been played by two of the finest actors, I think, in contemporary Hollywood, by James Woods and by Al Pacino.
That's right.
The James Woods film, the one that's called Citizen Cones, based on Nicholas Van Hoffman's biography of Cohn, is, I think, very, very good.
The thing that is most memorable to me, and it maybe is the moment that was in all the trailers for the Nixon film, is I don't know if a moment that even really happened, but it's Nixon staring up at the picture of John F. Kennedy in the White House. And I think it's during the Watergate thing, and he's sort of falling apart. And he says, Anthony Hopkins as Nixon says, they look at you and they see what they want to be, and they look at me and they see what they are. You've
identified what I consider the most important line in the entire film. Yes, absolutely. I quote it twice.
It's nuts. It's such a. I wonder who came up with that line, because it's like, I don't know if Nixon ever said that, but it seems to perfectly encapsulate what we're talking about here.
We do know, I believe, from David Eisenhower's indirect testimony, that in his last days in the White House, he did wander the halls at night looking at the pictures of all the presidents and perhaps talking to them. But I don't think there's any evidence that he said that. But this is the nature of historical fiction. You don't contradict anything that is known to be true, but you're free to extrapolate about things that we just don't have any evidence on, one way or the other. I think Stone obeys those rules pretty well. It's what Nixon ought to have said, isn't it? Whether or not he ever actually said it,
right?
It's what he. It's what he ought to have said.
Well, there's something sad about that. Even, I mean, another story that I was told when I was young about Nixon's rise is about the 1960 television debate, and everyone talking about how important it was that JFK looked a certain way and Nixon didn't. And there's something really humiliating about that seems like it would fuel a lot of resentment that you're talking about. This sort of like, it's literally like a sexual humiliation in front of the whole country.
Yeah. Marshall McLuhan but one of the things that provoked him to take an interest in the power of television was when he noticed in 1960 that a poll taken after the first Kennedy-Nixon debate among people who'd heard it on the radio revealed that most of them thought Nixon had done the better job. But among those who'd seen it on television, which of course was a larger number, Kennedy won.
And what do we do with that? I mean, doesn't that tell you a lot? I mean, all the way to the future. It's weird because, in some respects, you're kind of like, oh well, that's terrible because it shows how shallow the electorate is. They want to vote for the handsome guy and not the smart guy, or something like that. But there's also like a clever sort of play going on with a kind of with a visual sort of representation of self. And you mentioned it in your piece, which I read, the LA Review of Books piece from Nixon to Trump. You mentioned Trump's like baggy suits that don't fit, and his hair and all this stuff that like liberals tend to like make fun of and be like, look at his stupid suit. He can't even buy a suit that fits, etc. Compare him to Obama, who always has these great fitting designer suits. But it's sort of like not everybody sees those things the same way. Not everybody looks at a guy in a designer suit and thinks that's desirable. And not every guy looks at a guy in a rumpled suit and think that guy's a piece of shit or a loser. In fact, it's the opposite. There's a lot of cross-identification happening, it seems like. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Lots of people have rumpled suits, sure. And I mean, one interesting thing about Nixon is that after a career in which he had, on the whole, been popular and sometimes extremely popular, when he won the 60% 49 state landslide in 1972. After that, his popularity, of course, declined sharply as Watergate, spun towards its denouement of catastrophe, political catastrophe for Nixon. His standing in Congress, they never did get to vote on impeachment because he resigned, before they could get around to it. But Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker of the House, wanted to get some vote on the record. So he scheduled a vote to accept the report of the Judiciary Committee, which of course had been the report recommending impeachment. Mm-hmm. 3 people voted against it.
Wow.
And Nixon's, I don't know if you say allies anymore, but people he knew in the Senate said that if it got to the Senate, he would be lucky to get 12 votes. And I mean, the journalists who had actually sucked up to Nixon for much of his career, had pretty much turned against him. But there's a tremendous disconnect between that, what looks like almost unanimous opposition at the elite level. There were a lot of people who still liked him at the very end. I mean, I forget his worst polling number. It was low 30s, something like that. I mean, which is terrible by historical standards for a president. I think only Truman had managed to get lower than that at the time. I think he remains probably the least, the most unpopular president at a certain point in modern times. But it's still a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not like 3 votes in the House out of 435 people, right? Right. I mean, this gets back to what you were saying before. I mean, all those people, you were talking about a slightly earlier period, but it applies a later period too. All those people writing letters to the editor, it's a lot of those people who identified with Nixon and thought it was terrible what was being done to him. The Democrats and the liberals and the press were doing him in, and the Republicans were betraying him, not defending him anymore.
Well,
people who would say almost exactly the same thing about Trump.
Right. And I mean,
that.
the longer arc, it seems like, and the one that I inherited in the 80s and more so in the 90s through like Rush Limbaugh and characters like that was the sort of like rising hatred and resentment of liberals, elite liberals, sort of like clustered in cities, and all that represents culturally, etc. That's the specific resentment that was built, and it seems like it was tied. I mean, in a lot of ways, they've tied in the American imagination, sort of like policies that came from the working class in American history to this elite liberal project, right? Like they've sort of like it's been a very effective turn in some ways, for a conservative project to tie things like anything like the New Deal programs you're talking about to this shadowy elite people that are connected to Hillary Clinton.
Well, there's always, this goes back, I don't know how it probably goes back to the beginning, I think, of the Republic.
Yeah.
But it goes all more recently. I mean, it goes back to the McCarthy era, to the anti-communism of the McCarthy era, or the Red Scare of the 1920s. And all that. The mass movement is always maybe not quite so much in America as in Europe, but in America too. It's been that these kind of mass right-wing populist movements are based more on the in class terms on the lower middle class than on the actual working class. Trump's votes did not come from the white working class to anything like the extent that most of, if you actually look at the breakdown of the numbers as people have done, small business owners, people like that, not working class at all, were the most typical.
Well, you've got a great
although he certainly has working class support too, as did Hitler.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've got a great bit in that LA Review of Books piece that I'm looking at now, about the class element of Trump's coalition, and the idea that a lot of people on the left, even like liberals, you see defining class in different ways, defining class as like people that went to college are not working class anymore. And like, to me, that's a weird way of defining it, because I've spent much of my time as an adjunct professor at a million different like public colleges and community colleges, and been I've even taught, and I'm currently teaching classes on naval bases with a very working class population that I would not describe as elite people at all.
Well, right, then you know that, especially now, there are lots of people who have college degrees who are not only working class, but who are not in the prosperous sectors of the working class. On the other hand, there are lots of people who don't have college degrees, but are fairly prosperous. They're usually not rich, in the sense of being multimillionaires, but fairly. They might own a little business, has 3 or 4 employees. Classic petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah, I wonder what you think of that element as related to like Nixon and the cultural conservatism, because it seems like that sort of attack on college as a sort of hive of elite liberal attitudes and indoctrination center for Marxism and all that kind of stuff. You've heard all of this, I'm sure. You've been around college campuses your whole life. This isn't new to you. But it seems like it's won in a lot of ways. Like as a younger academic, I find it, I'm just sort of like always battling back a cultural image of college as that, when it's just not what my experience is at all. And it seems like in a weird way, like Nixon's distorted vision is in that sort of place. Yeah.
And that too goes back to McCarthyism and the anti-communism of what the historian David Count calls the Great Purge. McCarthy attacked elite institutions for the most part, the Ivy League and similarly prestigious universities, Harvard, Yale, Johns Hopkins, places places like that. He attacked the State Department. What's more, traditionally prestigious and elite than the State Department. And then, of course, he went a little too far and decided to attack the U.S. Army as well. And
have you no sense of decency, sir? Yeah.
Yeah, from the Army McCarthy hearings, exactly.
Well, I mean, doesn't MAGA seem like a modern McCarthyism in a sense, like Trump's movement, and not only Trump's movement, but sort of the QAnon and the larger, just like psychotic conspiracy right wing stuff that's happening online. Seems like it's like in a lot of ways a psychedelic Nixon land, and it's connected to this sort of resentment project, and it seems like it's part of a kind of continuity of anti-communism in a lot of ways. To me, it seems like it's aimed at all the same people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so far as I can think offhand, but I suspect this is right, Trump is the first important right-wing figure in America since McCarthy to attack the Pentagon. Nixon never did that. Nixon never attacked the military, perhaps partly because he actually had served in the military, although McCarthy had to, come to think of it. Trump, of course, did not, although he said that sleeping with a lot of women in New York was sort of the equivalent of going to Vietnam.
See, that endears that like sick joke endears him to people, weirdly enough, right? Like we hear that and we're like, oh Jesus. But the other part of me is like, the dark groan that I feel in my gut, if you want to get like Freudian and all that, is sort of like, it seems like it identifies a humor there that a lot of Americans are there. They're in that place where they think they respond to that positively, and they think that's their guy.
But you hear a lot of that among the Trumpians, that the Pentagon is full of woke generals. All will be fired if Trump wins. If Trump wins another term.
Well, I mean, he seems like he's maneuvering himself. Obviously, he's running for president, but it seems like he's maneuvering himself like Nixon in just an incredibly cynical way, right? Like he's going to try to capitalize on whatever stream of. There seems to be no like. I think that's part of what it is with Trump. Is like, to me, it seems like his craven desire for attention and power is so dominant, an element in his being, that there is literally no line that he won't cross in order to like maintain power or attention on him, even if that means capitalizing on the absolute ugliest streams of the American electorate and global politics.
Well, I would say that, I mean, there are some things Trump will not do. He won't read a book. He won't study anything seriously. Nixon was probably the most studious president.
Man, when I'm reading about Nixon, I'm always like, there's something admirable and amazing about this person in a way that I don't think about with Trump. I think of Trump as more as just kind of like pure reptile mind. And with Nixon, I see like a plucky individual, a rugged American individual who is, bootstrapping himself to the presidency. To me, there's something absolutely incredible about Nixon's rise through American politics. That isn't as incredible about Trump because he was born in a certain position.
Yeah, Nixon was really an intellectual. I mean, in the sense of somebody who read books and thought and was capable of disciplined thinking. I mean, obviously, Trump, just thinks about himself and watches cable news. Although I don't know how much Fox News he's watching anymore. He generally has bad things to say about it. Maybe he's watching.
He's lost Rupert Murdoch and all them. Yeah.
Sorry?
It seems like Trump has lost Rupert Murdoch and Fox News. They're not.
So, yeah. He's lost Murdoch. I think Murdoch's been he's turned the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post very definitely. against Trump. Did you see say what you like about the New York Post. They have the most brilliant front pages.
Oh yeah, we love it.
I guess my all-time favorite. This goes back to, it's probably not long after Murdoch took it over in the when was that, in the late 70s, early 80s, something like that. My all-time favorite, headless corpse found in topless bar. That is just a but you remember much more recently the front page of the Post on the day after Trump announced his candidacy for president again.
Yes.
Little, it was on the front page. It was a little headline. It wasn't really a headline, but a bottom line, saying Florida man makes announcement.
Right. Which was, the Florida man thing is like from The Onion, or like, it's like a parody. Like the Florida man thing, it's like there's something humiliating about it, but it's also, and I know we got to wrap it up here, but I can't think about all this stuff and Nixon and it's sort of like the haunting of Richard Nixon in our time, without thinking of DeSantis, who's making similarly cynical maneuvers in Florida, and seems like he is kind of ripping from the Nixon playbook in some ways in terms of the culture game he's playing.
I think we don't really know enough about DeSantis yet to draw too many conclusions with too much confidence. But yeah, I think that is the way it looks. He does seem to be more like Nixon in being, more seriously educated, more disciplined. He went to Yale, majored in, I believe, history and political science, and graduated with a 3.75 or so quality point average. Yeah, I think I think DeSantis is the more dangerous figure than Trump. Actually, Trump is so undisciplined, so lazy that. That limited. It certainly didn't prevent all the damage he could do, but it limited the damage he could do when he was president.
Well, it's funny.
I think DeSantis knows what he's doing in a way that Trump probably doesn't really.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I mean, I don't know where that's going, and none of us do. But I'm watching it, and I'm thinking about this sort of legacy, because one thing we're saying here is like, well, cynicism is such a terrible attribute of a politician, but it's sort of like, isn't every politician acting with a degree of cynicism? And like part of me is a person who watched the rise of Barack Obama as an incredibly cynical political figure, and like I don't know where you're at with all of that, but like the whole change you can believe in sort of slogans, all of that seemed in its own way just as manipulative and cynical a cultural and political game as someone like Richard Nixon would play. It's just that's the way politics is played. But to me, it's like, and I guess this is part of what Rick Perlstein's point is in Nixon land, which is that we're delivered into a time where it's just pure cynicism. And like, how could you forgive, how could you not forgive people for voting however they vote? Because it's sort of, everyone seems to understand how ugly the game is. We're in like a dark place.
Well, and it's probably always been true of politics. You read Anthony Trollope's political novels about Parliament in the Victorian age. It's a certain amount of cynicism tends to be required. If there's an exception in modern times, I would. My favorite American politician of modern times, Russ Feingold, who was senator from Wisconsin for a few terms.
I forgot that name, but now I remember. Yeah.
Was defeated by the horrible Ron Johnson. As it happens, I don't know Russ Feingold personally, but one of my best friends in college, he was one of my roommates senior year, he became a lawyer and was actually, as a young lawyer, was an associate with Russ Feingold. They were young associates together in a Milwaukee law firm, and I was talking to him sometime after. I forget how it came up that he was actually had been a colleague of Feingold's, and I always remember when he says, "Yeah, I was never surprised that Russ went into politics because he was always so interested in politics, but I am surprised that he managed to get elected because I always assumed he was just too honest to to get anywhere in politics."
Right.
But he did for, was it 2 terms or I think
he was doing like campaign finance reform and things like that, right? If I recall,
that was one of the issues that he was most identified with, the McCain-Feingold bill.
Right, yeah. Well, yeah, that element of Richard Nixon's sort of legacy is difficult to unpack, because on the one hand you're sort of like, well, he produced this cynicism, and the other part of it is kind of like, well, no, he capitalized on it in some ways, right?
Probably both, right?
Right. Well, this has been fun. It's always great to toss the ball around with you, Carl. I want to make sure that people check out your stuff on Nixon that we mentioned in this episode. So I'll include the links to your article in the LA Review of Books and to your book about Nixon and the kind of cultural and psychological elements of Nixon, which I think are, to me, the meatiest part of understanding this guy and what he's done to us.
Okay, well, it's been fun, and I'll be happy to join you again anytime you want.